Good morning and welcome. I'm Anita Shah. I'm Director of Regulation Value for Money at the National Audit Office, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our 4th annual regulation event. We've grandly titled the webinar, The Role of Regulators in a Changing World. Clearly, the most obvious change since our last webinar is our change of government, but more broadly, as we consider if a government has 3 main levers to deliver policy outcomes: tax, spend, and regulations. As new issues arise and in the challenging economic climate that we find ourselves in, we are seeing more and more being asked of regulators. And so to that end, I am delighted to welcome 3 guests to speak on the subject: Colin McLeod, Head of the UK Space Regulator at the CAA, Neil Lawrence, Director of Delivery and Schemes at Ofcom, and Cheryl Wilson, who leads on strategy, online safety strategy at Ofcom. They will be taking part in a 45-minute panel discussion facilitated by our own Matthew Rees, who leads our commercial practice and who has a career that spans working in the Competition Commission, Ofwat, and the Single Source Regulations Office. That will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box for us. But before the panel discussion, could I please hand over to Gareth Davis, our Comptroller and Auditor General, to give an introduction. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you, Anita, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar this morning. And I hope to make a very valuable use of your time for the short length of the webinar. As Anita said, I'm Gareth Davis. I'm the head of the NAO, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this session. Regulation is a really important focus for quite a lot of National Audit Office work. And in fact, just coincidentally, today we're publishing our most recent report, which is a focus on how government has been encouraging developers and property owners to remediate dangerous cladding on buildings after the Grenfell disaster. And so our focus in this piece of work is what's happened since the disaster and the progress in remediating cladding on high-rise buildings. But clearly, as we can see from the sobering report of the public inquiry into that disaster, at the root of a lot of this, and the root of the billions of pounds of public money that are now having to be paid to support that effort, is an issue around regulation. And the public inquiry was extremely critical of previous governments going back a long time and their approach to regulation of building safety. So it is a timely reminder that getting regulation wrong can have very serious consequences for people, life or death consequences, unfortunately, in the case of Grenfell, but also, a long tail of financial and stressful consequences for people occupying flats in high-rise buildings. And so, as I say, that it's actually quite hard to find an NAO report in which regulation hasn't played a role either directly and centrally or as one of the contributory issues. And so, that's all the more reason to have this annual webinar where we pull together experts from the field to tackle some of the current issues in regulation and also to reflect on some of the lessons from our own work over the last 12 months in this space. And on top of the work I've just mentioned on cladding, we've reported recently on the regulation of financial services. We've looked at the consequences for UK regulation following Brexit and the change in responsibilities for lots of UK regulators following that big change, and so on and so on, work across many areas. And our forward programme also focuses on regulation in some important areas. We have a piece of work, in fact, the current piece of work that Anita is leading is looking at the regulation in the water industry, which, as we know, the new government has announced a commission investigating that very topic. So we hope to be able to inform that work with our own audit of recent performance, the big risk factors, and what the evidence says about regulation of that really vital utility industry. So continues to be a big focus of our work, and I thought I'd just briefly recap some of the areas in which we've seen significant developments in addition to what's happening in water, just as a way of teeing up the panel discussion that our experts have kindly agreed to contribute to, along with Matthew. So we've seen regulation come under the microscope in some important areas, both the previous government and the new government. So reviews of significant public service regulators, for example, Ofsted and CQC, are already resulting in significant strategic change for those organisations. And those are reviews commissioned by the previous government and now being implemented by the new one. We've seen consensus around the creation of a new regulator for football, proposed by the previous government and again picked up and now being implemented by the new one, and also areas of clearer regulatory arrangements for growing bits of activity in the private and public sector, including space research, for example, and we have CAA representative on the panel to reflect on that this morning. So continues to be a lively area with lots of change, and above all, the new government has charged all regulators with taking account of their effect on the competitiveness of the economy and crucially on economic growth. So in other words, how much regulation is actually achieving its intended purpose, and how much is contributing to barriers and drags on what otherwise would be economic growth. Clearly a very challenging balance to strike. As I started off these comments by referring to today's report on post-Grenfell cladding remediation. That shows what happens if you get regulation wrong, or if you're complacent about the contribution that regulation makes to managing very serious risks. But clearly we also have gathered plenty of evidence on where regulation has not added value in an efficient way and has proved a barrier to innovation or to growth, and imposed significant costs on those trying to deliver services either in the public or the private sector. So this will be this is a constant challenge, one that will never go away completely, and it's a healthy challenge, I think, to all regulators to understand their impact on the ecosystem in which they operate. And our job, I think, is to provide unbiased, objective assessment of the evidence for how well that balance is being struck in different sectors and with different regulators. Clearly, a very big stakeholder for the NAO's work is Parliament, and Parliament's appetite for that kind of evidence-based assessment of the performance of regulation is undimmed. I get lots of requests, both from MPs and from members in the House of Lords, to provide evidence on concerns they have about the operation of regulation from all directions, including those who are concerned that regulation is not tackling some serious risks adequately, but also others who are concerned about the impact on growth and economic development. So that appetite for parliamentary scrutiny remains very strong. So I think that means that we're going to continue to focus in the way that I've described in the coming years. So I wish you a very valuable exchange of information and views this morning. Thank you again to our three panelists for giving up their time to contribute, and I'm very happy to hand over to Matthew Rees, who is the head of our Commercial Insights Hub, and as Anita has already said, has a kind of wide and deep background in different aspects of regulation. Over to you, Matthew.
Great, thank you very much, Gareth, and just delighted to see so many people on the call. I think we were over 250, so this has definitely been building over the last few years, and so it's really great also to have Anita taking over the regulation arena with a really good team. Rather than take up too much time with the intros, which have already been provided by Anita and Gareth, I'd like to first turn to Colin McLeod from the CAA to talk about his role in the sector, and I think we're going to share some slides for you, Colin, which I'll ask Sarah to do momentarily. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you very much for the invite to speak. I've got a number of slides. I think they're going to be shared afterwards, or they're certainly available afterwards. They're public slides. I'm not intending to speak in detail to every one, but I'll flash them up. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Just to start with, I thought it was useful from this to talk about this from this perspective of a new regulator. So while the UK has been regulating its satellites in space for about 40, 50 years, we actually took over for all space activity, including in 2021 on the back of this slide just gives a summary of what we're doing. Quite a large number of satellites, almost 750. We've got the second largest low Earth orbit constellation of satellites in the world. And I'll touch on some of this later on in the presentation, in that the number of launchers and spaceports that we license at the moment aren't as great as we were expecting when we were set up only 3 or 4 years ago. We've got the next slide, please. The slide deck was actually used a presentation last week for a joint European Space Agency and UK Space Agency event. So they're not exactly within what was originally suggested, but I thought they were too useful not to talk about. And one of the key messages that we have as a regulator for the sector is we want to be as invisible as possible. So one of the aims when we set up the regulator is to try and not be on the critical path to operations, but we are a regulator and not a licensing body, so it's quite difficult for a lot of people in the industry to understand the difference. But basically, when you issue a license, it's mainly compliance based, and you can look at high volume organizations like DVLA, whereas we are much more of an outcome focused regulator because we are very complicated, small numbers of cases, and a lot of our work is post licensing rather than issuing the license itself. It's about the future. Next slide, please. In terms of why we regulate things, spaceports are a really good example of what is dangerous in space activity. And the two pictures here are really to help industry understand why spaceports need to be regulated. They're more akin to a chemical factory than an aerodrome or a typical sounding rocket launch facility. And the reason is that the volumes and types of chemicals and materials that they need to undertake a launch are quite significant. And this is the first of a number of areas in space regulation where we have a lot of overlap with other regulators. So in the UK, the Health and Safety Executive are actually responsible for chemical factories, and they're also responsible for chemical activities on the ground at spaceports. My role in licensing a spaceport and then regulating it is about the public safety of the operations in relation to a space launch, which is a rocket leaving the launch pad to go to orbit. If they undertake general day-to-day activities of hazardous nature, the Health and Safety Executive are the regulator involved there. Next slide, please. In terms of why we regulate launch, this is just a picture of a potential launch from the north of Scotland, and the yellow and pink areas show the volume of airspace required and probably marine space as well, which could be impacted on by a space launch from that part of the UK. And you can see if that's the pink bit is heading towards the North Pole. Again, the overlaps we have with international partners on international agreements on environment, biodiversity, and also impact on commercial air transport are quite significant. It's one of the reasons the Civil Aviation Authority is the regulator for space, because we regulate that volume of airspace for commercial airlines, and I have a dependency therefore with my partners within the CAA and other countries and commercial organisations like NATS, who control the airspace, to make sure that we can keep people safe. Next slide, please. In terms of orbit, we license and regulate satellites in orbit. The graph at the bottom is something which shows the number of satellites and how they're increasing at a hugely, almost exponential rate over the last decades. Everyone on the call will have heard of probably Elon Musk and SpaceX, which are one of the biggest drivers to this volume of activity, because they have hugely reduced the cost and effectiveness of launch, but they are also launching their own constellation of satellites. And by constellation, I mean a large number of satellites, all in a similar orbit, normally, and delivering a service. And with SpaceX, it's an internet service for people on the ground. Next slide, please. Wouldn't dwell on this, but the journey to become the regulator goes through various steps of regulations, primary regulation, secondary regulation, and we get to the point where we can issue licenses and then continue to monitor them. And as I said earlier, we are a goal-setting regulation, which is outcome-focused. So that gives a lot of flexibility, and that's really, really important for sectors like space, which are very innovative. The sector often say that they would like far more clarity or compliance-based or criteria-based outcomes, but that only works for their particular technology, and it's not effective for a regulator to build lots of technologies, lots of criteria across different technologies. We look to make sure that the people who generate the risk and know it the best, they own the risk, and we are there to try and make sure, to the best of our abilities, that they can then operate as safely with as low risk to the public as possible. Next slide, please. Linking to what Gareth said earlier, we have two main, or our two primary functions are around protecting people and life. That's absolutely our first duty as the regulator for space. But we also have requirements and legislation to make sure that we recognise the importance of this to the companies who want to undertake the activity, so the growth and economic aspects. We're not there to stop activities, we're there to make sure they're undertaken as safely and effectively as possible. We then have a whole range of other obligations around environment and lots of tests, 7 tests that we have to carry out around finances and international obligations, for example. Next slide, please. One of the most important things I certainly feel for a safety regulator is independence from government. In my previous careers, I worked a lot in Central Whitehall, and I worked with nuclear activities. But the reason, as many people on the call will understand from a regulatory perspective, you cannot have decision makers taking decisions on operating activities which are hazardous in nature, who are also either funding or seeking economic or growth benefits from those activities. There's a blatant conflict of interest, and the two really high-level examples we often cite to the sector are the Piper Alpha disaster in 1988, 167 people died, and the Challenger space accident in 1986, which killed 7 astronauts. And the reports and investigations all showed the absolute importance of disassociating the decisions for licensing and regulation from people with a direct interest in the outcomes. And it's almost compulsory viewing for new entrants to my team to watch the great Netflix drama on the Challenger disaster. It's quite harrowing to watch from a regulator's perspective, but it really shows how the difficulty of taking the decisions for that operation took place in a background of risk. Next slide, please. Just a little bit on how we built the regulator in terms of lessons learned. There's lots of space regulators being developed and built around the world at the moment, and we work with partners globally because space really is a global endeavour. And some of these things may sound quite obvious. I mean, you try and plan about what your regulator will look like when you start, but our experience is possibly spend a little less time planning too much for the first 2 years, because first contact with new and complicated regulatory regimes and a new innovative sector mean that you have to build in a lot of contingency is the word that I would use, but I know that's not the word that we want to use very often in program management. A lot of it is thinking properly about the having a conscious bias in the effectiveness of your teams and your staff. They cannot be as good as they will be in 2 or 3 years' time. So you have to build your business model around that. Next slide, please. This is probably one of our highest profile activities that's taken place in the last year and a half. The Virgin Orbit launch from Spaceport Cornwall. It took off in January 23. There was an anomaly, so the rocket failed to reach orbit. But from a regulator's perspective, while there was a failure at the end of the mission, no one was hurt, no property was damaged, and it all failed within parameters. So from that perspective, it was effective. But if you move to the next slide, please, another big lesson that we learned is about media and engagement and communications. And on the top left, you see a comment from the Science Technology Committee, who had, I think, we had 3 sessions with them. So on the one hand, we were getting questioned in the media and up to a point by government about why it was taking so long to license and regulate Virgin Orbit and Spaceport Cornwall. Huge political pressure for a launch. Our independence was called into question many times. But I think the outcome was that we were still able to issue the license and regulation before the organisation needed them. And I think the media is important, as is engagement with your sector, because, as I said, we were challenged in the media all the way up to launch about it taking too long. After the failure happened, we were then castigated in the press for issuing license far too quickly and not taking due care and consideration. Now, that's the role of a regulator. I said at the start, we don't want to be in the critical path, and we don't. And we work very hard to try and keep ourselves off that path. But sometimes politics and the company's desire to support or gain investment can become quite overwhelming for them. Next slide, please. I talked about the importance of engagement there. We've had 2 reviews into the new regulations and operations already. One was around Virgin Orbit, run by government, and a second one by DSET on the mandatory review of, or part of a mandatory review of the regulation. The roles, responsibilities, and ownership have been cited in both of those reviews as quite difficult. And that's the difference, that's the point between government policy, government grant organisations, regulator, in this case myself and the space regulation team, but also the interaction with other regulators across the UK landscape and international partners and the sector. The landscape of engagement is very complicated for everyone involved, and trying to get that as clear as possible is key. Next slide, please. We invested a lot of time and effort on sector engagement, produced lots of documents, and looked at new and innovative ways to engage with them by developing things like workshops around safety case and environment, which proved to be quite challenging for the organisations as they started on their regulatory journey. Next slide, please. I am rattling through them, but I want to give other speakers plenty of time. Lots of examples of documents we produced are all available online. Being transparent is absolutely crucial. It helps gain trust, and we also publish our major licenses online. And I think this slide shows where we've tried to make changes which are within our gift, which include guidance, but we've also started to identify where some legal changes are required, and they're far more difficult. And as you get down that list, they require more time, resource and effort and parliamentary time to achieve. And the final slide, please. Just looking forward to the future. Continuous improvement and learning and engagement with the sector to try and understand what's important to them has been crucial to us getting to where we are today, which I think is a reasonably good position. We haven't got large backlogs or delays. Good relationship with domestic international partners and organisations, but continually trying to improve by things like our portals, our websites, and looking at the missions that are coming forward to us, trying to work our limited resources to focus on what's coming to us first. Yes, there's lots of long-term activities that we have to do. For example, we're involved in human spaceflight research and development, because that longitudinal work takes time and you've got to be prepared. But for some of the shorter term activities, it's getting the sector to accept and understand what the limitations we have are. But generally at the moment, we're able to keep ahead of them from good intelligence and good partnerships with them. And I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Colin. Just before I turn to Cheryl from Ofcom, I'd just like to remind participants that if you put your questions into the Q&A box, we're going to come to them as a panel discussion at the end. So, Colin, there are one or two questions that have appeared as we've gone along, but rather than bring you into that, what we'll do is we'll turn to Cheryl now, and she's from Ofcom, and then hopefully as we get more Q&As into the box, we'll be able to have a cross-section of discussion points for everybody to chip in on. Cheryl, very much welcome your contribution. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yep, I'm Cheryl Wilson. I'm an online safety principal at Ofcom. I lead on our online safety strategy, and I've worked in various roles for about 5 years to implement the online safety regime. So thank you for inviting me to share some insights into online safety. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've built the regime up from the ground, some challenges that we've faced, and I hope you will find that useful. I don't have any slides, by the way. So just a small amount of background. Ofcom, the communications regulator, was formally appointed as the online safety regulator when the Online Safety Act was passed in October 2023. This was a massive expansion of our role as the comms regulator, expanding on our role, which we already have in regulating telecoms, post, and other traditional communication sectors. And for those who don't know, the online safety regime is essentially designed to make it safer for UK people, especially children, to be online. And the major focus is really on social media platforms and making sure that they identify and manage the risks to people using their services, and that they have the systems and processes in place to keep users safe. So how have we prepared for this? So although we were formally appointed last year, in reality, we've been preparing for this role for quite a long time, since the policy started emerging. And we really hit the ground running in the last couple of years to make those preparations. One element of this was supporting government in developing the policy and the legislation, and really making sure that it would work well in practice when it comes to fruition. This was a complex and challenging task to help formulate the legislation and help with that process. We've also had to build the team up from scratch, and this has involved a combination of bringing in policy experts, increasing our legal and economic resource, and also building our online technical capability. So what started as a team of around 20 people is now in the region of kind of 400 within a couple of years. And this has involved people moving within Ofcom, but also many new colleagues. And then in terms of building the foundations for the regime, we've undertaken a vast array of research to understand people's behaviours online, how much they experience harm, what children do online, and the drivers for harm. And this is all fed into our foundational policy work that we've done. And that's taken, an incredible amount of work and resource to deliver that. And we've published now groundbreaking complex policy documents, which will be the foundations of the regime in years to come. And this includes our codes on protecting everybody from illegal harms and protecting children online. So this is a very exciting time for Ofcom, as after all these years of preparation, starting from next January onwards, the regime will start coming into force. and duties will start applying to services and become enforceable. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've faced and how we've kind of handled those. So as with any organisation growing in this way, there's been some operational challenges along the way. We've had to do an awful lot of recruitment and growth in this time, which has an impact in itself on resources overall, whilst you're trying to deliver a lot of policy development work and evidence and research. So Ofcom implemented its own online safety group last year to help solidify the team and build like dedicated teams on policy and also supervision to build relationships with platforms. Generally, we've benefited hugely from building this regime in an existing well-established regulator. Although we've brought in many new people and experts, we've really been able to use a lot of the existing expertise within Ofcom to help build the regime. And also we've benefited from just general efficiencies in our corporate services and things like that. Another of the big challenges that we faced, sort of similar to the previous presentation, is regulating services that might not have been regulated before or try to sort of avoid regulation, as it were. We estimate, sort of based on government estimates, that there's over 150,000 services that come within the scope of this regime. Many of them won't understand regulation, won't understand our expectations. So to mitigate that, we've put a lot of focus on building constructive cooperative relationships with those services, the biggest and the smaller ones that are risky that will engage with us. And we've also put a lot of effort into thinking about what resources can we put out there that services can use to help guide them through this new regime. So we've built a sizable supervisory team, and their goal is to build those positive relationships with services, help them understand what we need to do to comply, and help make sure that happens as soon as possible. Ofcom has already been the regulator for a small set of online platforms since 2020 through the narrower video sharing platforms regime, which include some notable services such as TikTok and Snap. So that's also given us like a real life experience in what regulating online platforms is like, and a test bed for us to trial different ways of working, knowing that this bigger job is coming. Another challenge that we face is just the high profile nature of this work and public expectations. It's a very topical area, and children, as we all know, are basically growing up online. So we face a lot of scrutiny in doing this role. We hope platforms face a lot of scrutiny in complying. Ultimately, we're moving as fast as we can now, but we're realistic that change won't necessarily happen overnight. And I think that's a challenge we'll kind of face in the coming years. But as I said before, we're finally moving into the regime going live from January onwards, and hopefully we'll start to see some change, some real life change happen. Within Ofcom, like we really do have a fantastic opportunity here to make change for UK people online. Although there are other jurisdictions setting up online safety regimes or have established online safety regimes, we arguably have like the biggest operation, the most developed laws and the most resources to make a change here. And so it really is a great opportunity for us as we move forward into 2025 and beyond. A final challenge just to note is obviously the global nature of online regulation. We're going to be regulating services that fall outside of the UK. We're going to be regulating services that are subject to other regulatory regimes. So a large part of our work is also collaborating with other international regulators. We're part of the Global OS Regulators Network, which also helps with that work. And that will be a continued focus going forward as we deal with regulating all of these services, which are global in nature. I think I'll leave it there, but happy to answer questions as they come through at the end.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. It's a very interesting discussion about Ofcom and how it is approaching the online safety arena. Our final panel speaker is Neil Lawrence from Ofgem, and so hopefully we can bring up his video now. I see that's already happened. Hello again, Neil. Hand over to you. Great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks. So to those of you on the call, I'm Neil Lawrence. I'm the Executive Director of Delivery and Schemes at Ofcom. I've been in this role for about 15 months, and prior to this, I worked on the energy crisis as Retail Director at Ofcom. I first started working in the sector many years ago in 1996, before spending significant amounts of time at both Centrica, British Gas, and then as an advisor at Deloitte. So it's fantastic to be here today. I really value the work that the NEO does. They've provided some real support to me personally, and I had a really positive experience of working with them, and I hope to continue that as we move into the future. So today I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about what Delivery and Schemes does within Ofcom, and our unique position as a delivery organisation within a regulator. I think it just gives some context, first of all, about Delivery and Schemes to situate the discussion. So we're an organisation of over 750 staff that delivers over £10 billion worth of grants and schemes on behalf of governments in their effort to reach net zero while protecting consumers. So we support renewable heat, renewable electricity, and fuel poverty schemes. Now, some of our schemes are smaller, less well known. Others are larger, such as the boiler upgrade scheme you may well have heard of, or the feed-in tariff and renewables obligation, and all of those are pretty high profile. All of the schemes are critical to improving energy efficiency and improving our use of renewable heat and renewable power across the UK. Now, taking a step back, we all face an absolutely humongous challenge around getting to net zero. And I think everybody would agree who works in the sector that so far, I don't think we've cracked that, and we need to make some significant changes as we move forward to ensure that we do everything we can to meet that goal. And we can really make a difference with our work at Ofcom to support those goals. So it's a really fantastic area to be working in. Now, the Delivery and Schemes business has grown exceptionally over the last 5 years, and it brings its challenges. And the challenges that we face today, and the challenges that we will continue to face in the future as we drive towards net zero. So thinking about that expansion, thinking about the need for the goal, what are some of the lessons that we've learned, and what are some of the things that we've done to set the organisation up to take on those new responsibilities over time, deal with that scope creep, and set us up really for success? Well, as I reflected around those items, the first thing I really wanted to talk about was really the operating model. We spent a lot of time in Ofcom considering that, and considering the needs that we need to support a scheme and regulate those participants in the scheme end to end. So we structured a very clear functional models, splitting out the areas of accountability and responsibility across that journey, ensuring that we can act efficiently and effectively, and ensuring that we really look after that public money and the spend that we oversee, delivering value for government. And we've created that architecture in a way that enables us to be scalable. So by having that functional model, we can add in extra teams, we can add in extra schemes to the model, and we've got a well-tracked pathway to do that. But that operating model has been really key to our success to date, and will be going forward. The second thing that we've really thought about during our journey has been the use of digital. And we've got a very deliberate strategy to build digital into everything we do. Scheme participants expect that, consumers expect that, and we need to be on the front foot. So our concept has been to build it once and redeploy it as we take on different responsibilities to keep a consistent scheme participant journey and customer journey to help people interact with the system. We've got a digital team embedded within our own organisation in Delivery and Schemes. They sit next to the people who work in operations. They sit next to the people that work in compliance to try and help ensure that they understand those journeys. And that really helps with quick development of digital solutions and correction of issues and problems. And I think it's a real differentiator for the organisation, and something we're going to continue to invest in the future. The third thing that I think has set us up for success as one of the largest delivery organisations for schemes is making sure we've got a very clear criteria of what we do and don't do. So it's very easy when people come up with an idea, something that's very plausible, to think, yep, we can lean in, we can do that. But actually us setting out some very clear guardrails about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do has enabled us to plot a path that ensures that we keep our organisation working in a way that's sustainable, and we work within areas that we're well skilled to do, and we don't take on things that we know we're not going to make a success of. And that helps us play to our strengths, and has helped us, I think, build a reputation within delivering schemes as people that can deliver on our promises. The fourth thing that I reflect on is really the way in which we think about risk. We manage on behalf of government a huge level of financial risk. This is taxpayers' money going through those schemes and grants, and we need to think very, very carefully about how we work and how we consider the risks of the different schemes, the assurance regime that's needed, and the controls that's needed to protect that money and keep us operating effectively. So we've got very much an embedded risk and controls framework that is part of everything we do, and we spend a lot of time and effort educating our teams, educating the industry on those issues and those problems that can arise within each of the schemes to try and help ensure we're ahead of the game and tackle those things successfully. And I think that will set us up in good stead for the future. We've also got a very, very clear set of strategic outcomes. And I heard one of the other speakers mention outcomes. It's really, really clear. And by having those outcomes of increasing impact for our customers, maximising values for taxpayers' money, and improving what it's like to work in delivering how gives us a North Star to help us focus all of our activities on. So just a few reflections there that I thought I'd share in terms of how we're set up and how we're challenging, how we're reacting to challenges. Now, on those challenges we do face, and thinking a little bit more about what's in the current sphere, let's just think about some of the things that we really need to get into the detail on, and we really need to deal with today and tomorrow. So I think the first thing is the complexity of the schemes and the complexity of the regulations required to underpin them. What we operate in is a very, very complicated world that requires interpretation and thinking about the application of the regulations. So we do a lot of work on guidance and do a lot of work on interaction with the industry to ensure that those things are implemented correctly, and this is critical. But you're operating in a really, really fast-moving world where you need to obviously regulate for now and design guidance for now, but you're actually also thinking about what might happen in the future and what's the new bit of technology or gadget that affects the regulation or affects the scheme that you're delivering, and you need to be ahead of the game. So we deal with that changing world all the time. And we as a regulator obviously deal with challenges and challenges to some of our compliance activity, for instance. So we need to think very, very carefully about how we deal with that. And how do we respond? We've got a very skilled policy team who are there and have a very, very clear process of how to adapt and interpret and turn that legislation into action. We've got lots of specialist support from engineering and technical individuals to help us with the right assessments. We have a crack legal team as a regulator to help us ensure that we can support cases on and deliver the outcomes that we want and take the action as appropriate. And last of all, and I think one of the other speakers mentioned this as well, it's about engagement. It's about us getting out there, talking to the industry, listening to what's happening, understanding what issues are arising, and what is a very, very complex landscape, foreseeing those problems and being flexible around that engagement to ensure we're in touch. Another issue that we face is thinking about how we accurately allocate the resources to the schemes. And think about the specialist skills that are also required now but into the future. We've designed flexible operating models. We invest a huge amount of time and effort in training and development of our staff and use of different government departments to ensure that we can make the best of the resources that we have, being that at the end of the day, some of the resources we need are very expensive to buy in. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip through a few of the other challenges. One of the other things that I really am focused on at the moment is around the fact that we have to oversee what is a very, very complex landscape across the supply chain and across the delivery of net zero. And at times it's quite hard to know exactly what you're responsible for and what other government departments are responsible for. So we spend a lot of time working with counterparts across that chain, working with them, using our voice and stretching our powers to ensure that consumers are protected against harms. We are but one cog in the wheel, and sometimes there are bigger changes required, and we work very closely with government on options to do that. Other challenges that we also face is around speed versus accuracy. We are driving against that net zero challenge, and sometimes you want to get things done really quickly and get them done to maximum effect, and that involves taking a degree of risk. And it's fine to do some of that and to get things implemented at times, but we need to think about that risk, be aware of it, and there's always a speed versus accuracy challenge that we're facing. I'll major also on one more thing, which is around fraud. It is a huge challenge within the business that we operate in. We are a huge target and we have to keep on our toes. The fraudsters are aware of schemes and values, and we have to be on the front foot. So it's a key part of our strategy. We work with governments and other agencies and lean on them for their expertise to try and ensure that we stay ahead of the game and we can protect that value and protect that customers, but protect the government money that's given to us to distribute. So what will we see in the future? What are those remaining challenges that we're really focused on? Well, I think we've counted some of those as we go through. We absolutely know the government wants to go faster. We're very supportive of that. We're keen to help and want to invest additional funds in ensuring that we have the right architecture to support net zero. So we need to be ready to meet that demand. So, you know, making sure that we're set up, ready to scale, set up, ready to meet that challenge. And we're set up with the right links into different government departments so that we can make the best of the whole government machine to deliver what we need to. We also have to work very closely with the industry. This is a technologically savvy market that's moving at lightning speed, and the developments are there. So we need to think very carefully about what's coming down the chain, the changes to existing schemes, and how new schemes need to be designed, working with government to ensure that they meet the outcomes and they support customers and scheme participants. I have a hugely exciting role. I have probably the best role in the Ofgem organisation at the moment. I really do feel that we're adding value, and be delighted to accept questions from you today as we meet the challenge of net zero moving forward.
Well, thank you very much, Neil, and all the panelists. So we've really heard a whole cross-section of views, and I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A as this has been going. So if we can perhaps bring up all of our speakers from the panel session onto the screen, and then what I'd hope to do is to perhaps just give a round table of questions so that we can ask each of you to just come in on these briefly. We'll keep it fast-paced, so try and get through maybe 5 or 6 type of questions. So the first one that came in was when we think about developing regulatory policy in a fast-moving environment, what are the key lessons that you've drawn from your experience? And if I could perhaps come to Cheryl first on that fast-moving environment and regulatory policy aspects, please.
Yep, a great question. So the way the Online Safety Act is framed is that it's tech neutral. We then, as Ofcom, have to publish codes setting out what online services have to do to comply. So a big challenge within that has been keeping those codes tech neutral, and that's, you know, in recognition of the fact that we need regulatory certainty for services, but also we need these codes to continue applying as tech evolves. So it's definitely a big focus for us, but the way the framework operates is tech neutral, which is positive to keep abreast of technology.
Thank you, Cheryl. Perhaps, Neil, I mean, you touched on the pace at which things have been moving. Would you have any further thoughts on that, how that affects your own regulatory policy, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the key thing, and this is not just for delivery and scheme business, but it's elsewhere as well, is really that engagement strategy. So you've got to get out there and talk to the people that interact with the schemes or interact with the regulation that you utilise. You can design something for today, and often when you're implementing regulation, you're implementing a set of rules based on what you know. You're trying to think about what could happen in the future, but the landscape, the environment around you will change, and you can't think of every possibility. So you need to be able to adapt. So you've got to get ahead of that by going out and speaking to customers. When I speak to customers, speak to scheme participants, you get that sense of what might not be quite working, and you can learn to react with that. I think the second thing for us is creating a model where you have some capacity to adapt. We're all under extreme pressure financially with budgets, and we're all under extreme pressure for delivery. but you've got to have some slack in the system to deal with what you don't know is coming in the next week or in the next month. That's a new issue that you need to jump onto, and you need to be able to adapt to that really quickly. And I think with all of this, it's not just about the kind of technical bit about the regulation. It's about how you implement that in a digital way so that people can interact and get the changes into the digital systems quickly. That's why I really cherish the fact I have this digital team sitting there being able to make changes to systems and processes quickly at speed. So when those changes happen, people aren't waiting 6 months to see them, or there's some horrible workaround. Just a few reflections from me, Matthew.
Great, thank you, Neil. Colin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Neil and Cheryl were saying. Particularly from us, it's outcome focused rather than criteria based, because the minute you set criteria, the technology overtakes you and it causes problems. I think it's worth drawing out that you do need slightly different solutions for different areas. So I think Neil and Cheryl have got high volume activities where we've got much lower volumes. But as I said earlier, what we try and do is issue authorization for activities to take place as early as possible, but with conditions, and then we can vary licenses or vary approvals and activities going forward when technology improves or changes, without going around the entire regulatory loop again, which tends to be the challenge if you set too strict a compliance. Industry prefer compliance because it gives them greater certainty, but that really doesn't work when you've got fast-moving innovation or technological missions and activities coming forward.
Right, thank you. So the next question that I was just stitching together from some of the web chat here was just how you each look at measuring the successes and outcomes of your regulators. And I think some of you had mentioned that actually success is sort of perhaps not being in the public eye as much as might be the case when things are challenging, but just focusing on the kind of the successful outcomes that you achieve. How do you recognize and measure that so that you're confident that you're on track? And maybe I could come back to Neil for that first on the success criteria and measurement.
Yeah, it's an absolutely cracking question. So I think part of this comes in terms of the outcomes that we want and the measures. So when we look at the implementation of the scheme, it's driven at a government policy. So you're looking at the measures that go on walls. So for instance, with heat pumps, you're looking at, are we driving an increase in the number of installations? So that is the top level metric you're trying to sort of keep track of. But actually it's deeper than that. It has to be deeper than that. So the success measures then are around, the compliance around those things, the protection of public money. And we have a huge suite of KPIs that we track that drive those measures. Outside of that, what you're also looking at is the risk within the schemes more broadly, and you're looking to see whether those key risk indicators are giving you the metrics that you would expect to see, that helping you challenge your problems and issues that you may be about to encounter. So how many compliance cases are you getting on certain schemes arising? Well, you may have something wrong if that's the case. Do people understand the regulation? Do they are they interpreting it in the wrong way? Is there something wrong with your guidance, or are they just not complying with the scheme and you need to take action? There's a whole suite of things there. And when you think about the success, you're right, Matthew, it is deeper than just that sort of top level view. This is an incredibly complicated world that we all operate in, with a number of different facets to consider.
Right, thank you, Neil. And perhaps Cheryl, do you have thoughts on the success measurement question, please?
Yeah, I mean, fairly similar insights, but yeah, a big focus of our work now, as we sort of start out on this journey as the regime goes live, is to think about how we measure the impact of it as a whole, but also how we measure the impact of specific measures that we are asking services to take, and our economics team will spend a lot of time on that. But yeah, it's not necessarily straightforward. As I mentioned in my opener, we've got fairly long-running research now into children and adults' media use, and also how they operate online, and that can help give us like an understanding of the harm online experienced by UK users. And we will continue with that programmatic research year on year, and that will help us track how things are moving online. But also, it's not just about engaging with people, it's about engaging with the services, and we have the powers, as in other regimes, to request information from them on metrics of harm, and we can also require them to publish transparency reports with particular information about metrics of harm. A lot of them do that already, but we'll be able to influence what those reports say, and then we can obviously draw that together and publish kind of findings across the board on those types of metrics. And it's not set in stone yet, but there are things that we can measure, such as the amount of content reported, how many users view a bad piece of content, how long it took to take it down, things like that. So those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about now to measure year on year the impact.
Very good, thank you, Cheryl. Colin, over to you on success. How you measure success from a regulatory outcomes point of view?
Well, as I said, it's good success has not been in the media. If the companies are happy and governments are happy, that's generally the best place to be. If you get that balance wrong through either policy or regulating, either from a lax perspective or too heavy-handed perspective, all of those things cause problems for everyone. I think as a new regulator for space, it's quite hard to be much more metric driven because we've got limited numbers of metrics, but we work a lot with other countries and other regulators around the world. Almost every mission is multi-jurisdictional. We do lots of research and recording of all the incidents which take place to try and give us insight as to what's happening and where we can possibly learn in the future, but also focusing everything that we learn on continuous improvement at the moment. So it's a new regulation, it's a new process with new companies. So anytime we identify something that lots of people thought was a really great idea, so for example, we have parent company guarantees in space to try and limit liabilities or risk. And our companies come forward to us in the last couple of months and said, actually, this puts a greater burden on the parent guarantee company than the company undertaking the activities. And we said, oh, right, yes, that's actually true. So it's that reflection and being able to change. And that, for me, one of the key metrics to go back to the sector all the time is you're telling us this, these are the changes that we can make or improvements we can do to make it easier for you. So that the metric is, if there are metrics, they're changing quite quickly, I think, I suppose is what I'm trying to say.
Great, thank you. So move on to another theme that had come up, and it's really around investigations when things go wrong. And perhaps we'll stick with come to Colin in a minute on that first. So in each of your areas, there are various incidents, accidents, or harms or frauds that could happen. And just to give a high-level overview of how the regulator responds, what it does, and what the sort of final outcome of those reviews are, please. So perhaps if I could come to Colin first on that.
Yeah, this is really important for us because this is what I was saying earlier about moving an outcome to a monitoring activity regime. So once our companies have a license, we then enter a monitoring phase. There's monitoring plans which they sign up with, and we inspect on a risk basis against a number of factors to make sure they're doing what they're meant to be doing and they're doing it to the required quality. We've got a team that's reasonably recently been stood up, and they are now fully warranted with powers under the law for entry. And we have we're building our full enforcement model. And in terms of enforcement, we can do everything from sending stern letters to prosecutions, fines, and jail. So we've got a whole range of hopefully proportionate penalties which can be put in force. Probably one of the most difficult ones for some companies could be there's a fit and proper person test. If someone's done something wrong in one company, it means they can't then start another company or be involved in a significant way in a future enterprise. So there's the sorts of things that we can deploy. We haven't had to do that in anger yet to that level, but it's inevitable that will happen at some point.
Thank you, Colin. And perhaps come to Cheryl then on that. how you then respond to incidents and investigations, please.
Yep, sure. So as I mentioned, we've stood up a supervision team, and their goal is to engage with the largest services and some other small risky services to really understand their service and what harms are emerging there and where they're at in terms of compliance. So I think as we move into regulation going live, and indeed already sort of cooperative open conversations is always hopefully the first port of call where things aren't where they should be, and often is the most efficient outcome to getting improvements for users and people. So we'll definitely be engaging informally, but sometimes enforcement is necessary. Ofcom has a well-established enforcement team that deals with other regulated sectors, which will be taking on online safety enforcement, and indeed has already handled enforcement under the video sharing platforms regime. So in those cases, we'll take a proportionate and strategic approach to enforcement. We'll think about the nature of the harm and the message that opening an investigation sends to the sector in deciding whether to investigate. As with many other regulated sectors, we've got a vast array of information gathering powers. We can interview people, we can commission a skilled persons reports if we want to look into a specific system in more detail. And then ultimately we can find a company to be not in compliance with the regulation and can issue penalties. And in the most serious cases, we have the powers to impose business disruption measures, which includes seeking to block the service for UK people or block their access to financial services and things like that to stop revenue. So yeah, that's a quick overview.
Very interesting. Neil, perhaps finally on that, and then we'll do two more questions, and then we'll move to closing remarks.
Yeah, sure. So it's very, very similar, really. We've got a huge monitoring regime. We collect masses of data each month from all of the actors in the industry to understand what's going on. Sometimes things get reported to us by participants. Sometimes things get whistle-blown to us. Sometimes our own intelligence kind of uncovers things. And when that happens, you go through this kind of funnel of, well, okay, what's going on? Is it compliance activity? Is it, a little bit of misdemeanor? What's gone on? How do you work that through? And then you get into, well, okay, then does it meet the criteria for investigation and potentially enforcement activities? So we go through that funnel. Just a couple of things just to add, because I don't want to sort of just repeat what Cheryl said. I think there's a consistency in the process there. I think one of the challenges here is that when you're into that harder end of enforcement activity, it's very, very complicated. It takes a lot of time to collect the data and the evidence to be able to see that through and make a investigation stand up in court. And you're working against organisations that are very well organised. You may want to take that challenge on with the regulator, and that takes a lot of time, effort, and money, and encounters a lot of legal risk when you go through those processes. So they're often seen, I think, as well, are we perhaps being too slow? I think we have to go through a very, very thorough process, and that's often a challenge that we're under when you're at that harder end to ensure that the measure sticks.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for that. As I said, I'll just do two more questions. So the first one that come up in a question, which perhaps for everybody, is just the funding model. So you mentioned budget constraints and the challenges of delivering new requirements. But could you perhaps just mention a little bit for the audience about broadly how the regulator is funded and whether it's charging different aspects of the universe that's regulated. Perhaps I come to Colin first, then Cheryl, and back to Neil.
Yeah, of course, it's quite straightforward for us. Individual satellites under a 1986 regulation are charged at about £6,500 to grant a licence. That's an old regulation. It's not really what we use as much anymore, but that still stands, and it limits our flexibility somewhat. All our other costs are met by Department for Transport as a new and innovative regulator. The government intends to consider charging, but as we sit here today, no other country in the world charges for space regulation. So that's a difficult thing for them to square off with HMT policy. But at the moment, DFT supports us through a Section 12 grant, which is very welcome. And so far, it's been sufficient for what's been required for us.
Right, thanks. Cheryl, any brief comments on funding?
Yeah, I think on the whole, Ofcom is funded by regulatory fees. I'm not an expert, but broadly, it's apportioned as per regulatory activity, as you might expect, with the biggest players paying the most. For online safety specifically, we're not charging fees yet. We are in the process of building the fees infrastructure that needs to be in place for that to happen. We recently published a consultation on how fees would be calculated, if you're interested on geeking out on that. We expect to charge fees from 26-27. Obviously, we're engaging closely with services that might be impacted by that, and it's obviously a slightly controversial topic. So it's an interesting area. Maybe the other thing to mention is that for the moment we're funded for online safety by government, but once this fees regime is in place, the legislation allows for the setup costs to also be recouped via fees. So it's quite a complicated space, but yeah, it will be paid for by fees.
Great. Neil, on funding, please.
Yeah, so we've got a dual model. So the delivery and schemes business, which is about implementing those government policies, that is funded directly by government. So our operating costs, our costs of administering that scheme, is funded directly by government. And then on the regulatory side of the business, so activities around the markets, activities around infrastructure, they're funded via the licence fee. And that number is agreed by Treasury as part of budget settlement. So we've got two funding models in essence in Ofcom.
Excellent. Thank you. So we've been running very sort of efficiently on time, and I think rather than exhaust all the panel with might end up being an interrogation, I'm going to just ask one final question, and then if each of you wanted to make any sort of closing remarks, that there's certainly time for that. So the question is really about dealing with the complexities that each of you has and attracting the specialist skills that you need to make things simple for people to understand. So just that sort of that logic of complexity, the skills you need for it, and making things accessible to the wider kind of audience that you're regulating. And perhaps any thoughts on what challenges that brings and how you overcome those challenges? And perhaps I could come back to Colin first, please.
Thanks. It's a really interesting, tricky question, Matthew. I think we're all very different regulators, and when you talk about simplifying things, for me the question is who are you simplifying and why. A company that wants to launch a rocket which is costing tens of millions of pounds, has a high hazard risk and threat to human life, I don't want to simplify it too much. My role is to make sure that they understand what they're doing. So it may not be simplifying too much, but it may be offering other avenues. So what we try and do, as we've learned, is we've developed, as I said earlier, workshops to try and help them understand what we're looking for. We're developing more products, but we also invest far more time and money now in going on site to go and see them. So we'll go and visit them. Quite often that could be the other side of the world, but we go and see them to get their technical experts to speak to our technical experts. So there's very much a role for us to simplify some of the messages at the higher level for CEOs and investors about what we're trying to achieve. But in terms of actual delivery of very complicated outcomes, safety cases, and ongoing monitoring, I think it's not necessarily just simplifying, it's offering all these other avenues and resources to try and support them on their journey through licensing and onward regulation.
That's really, really helpful and insightful. Cheryl, there's complexity in the digital world. How would you respond to this question about making the the regulation approachable and simple enough?
Yes, and I think very similar thoughts and similar challenges, really, I guess, and maybe an added challenge for us is just the breadth of services in scope, which is, you know, large, the biggest companies in the world, to kind of one-man band people running a forum or something. So kind of, as I've said before, we've got, you know, we've got different strategies for different parts of the sector, I suppose. The biggest services, the big names, will have dedicated resource speaking to them. That doesn't necessarily need to be simplified. But for kind of everyone else, we're definitely thinking about similarly what resources we can have. So digital resources that kind of take people through what they should be doing, whether they're in scope, because that's like a big enough question in itself. And then how do they do a risk assessment, and have they thought about all the things they need to think about? So we're putting a lot of effort into that at the moment. We already have and will continue to do webinars for when big policy pieces come out to help explain those and answer questions, and that will continue in the future. And then we're also thinking about future events and workshops and videos and other campaigns that we can do to kind of get the message out there. And at least if we can ensure that people know that they're in scope and that they need to be doing something, and that's at least more like the start of the journey, making sure that they take steps to comply. So I hope that helps.
Very good. Thank you very much, Cheryl. Any thoughts on this question, please?
Yeah, I mean, like Cheryl, we deal with anything from very, very small, you know, single occupancy homes and individuals trying to get on a journey, right up to multinational companies. So you have to have a strategy for that encompasses all of that. At the big end, you know, very much have dedicated relationships, dedicated people who manage those relationships. We have a forum that anybody can come along to. We talk about changes, we engage with them to sort of help work that through. And then you look through to the other end where we're dealing with individuals who want responses. We do have call centres. We do man those call centres. Apart from very, very small number of days in the year where people can talk to and interact with our people, we can get the inquiry logged. We can then engage with our specialist teams to try and make sure that we can offer the right response. One of the challenges we often come up against is people want advice about what to do in relation to the regulations, and that's quite a tricky one to handle around, you know, us leading the witness around what they need to do. That's quite tricky to handle in terms of the interactions. And to try and improve the experience, we are investing in AI technology, and we've got some trials going on at the moment around the answering of what we would call the simplest inquiries that we get the highest volume on, whereas the computer can actually answer those quite simply by pointing people to the right documents that are already on our website and explaining that in a way and answering the questions that the scheme participant or consumer is asking. Obviously, we need to do that with safety in mind. So there's a human in the loop on quality checks at the moment as we build up the skill in that space. And we will get a lot more inquiries moving forward, a hell of a lot more, as this sector continues to grow.
Fantastic. Well, thanks all of you. I've tried to do my best to cover all of the questions in a way which has given everybody an opportunity to come in. If any of you wanted to add any final comments, either of your own or based on any of the other questions, then we've got a few minutes for that. But if not, don't feel concerned that you have to. Anita is going to make some closing remarks at the end of the webinar. So perhaps just check whether Neil, Colin, or Cheryl, whether you had any further thoughts you wanted to raise with the audience.
For me.
Very good.
No, that's all. It sounds like we're all dealing with very similar challenges, so it's been very interesting to hear from everyone.
Well, it's been really, really valuable to have all of your comments today. So thank you very much indeed for sharing all of your thoughts, presentations, and answering such a range of questions. I'm going to hand over back to Anita now to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all our speakers. So thank you so much to Neil coming along from Ofcom to explain how they're moving into delivery schemes and the challenges that he's seen. Colin, who's heading up space regulation for the CAA, and also Cheryl for explaining the challenges going ahead for setting up online safety regulation. My personal takeaways from this insightful session is that as regulators expand, we need to be mindful of not losing sight of their original purpose. And I think that's something Colin and Cheryl in particular spoke to, but also Gareth at the very beginning. And that is ultimately the key risks that they're here to protect, and protect consumers from harm. There are clearly challenges with engaging new sectors, and we must be thoughtful of, as we move forward, how we ensure regulation is fit for purpose and that the impacts are monitored. Also taking away from a few comments, I think it's really helpful for Neil to talk about the importance of that flexible operating model, and we can see that through all three of our regulators who came today. So any other regulators on the call might be worth keeping in mind that flexible operating model and how it might change going forward. But also investing upfront in digital solutions, and as you're tailoring your digital solutions, to keep that agility in mind. And my final takeaway was one around however complex the landscapes remain, it's hugely helpful to keep your eye on the scope and the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and be clear on how you achieve that. So with that, I also want to thank everyone for participating and your wonderful questions that have been so helpful. And also my internal team, our internal team, which is Sandeep Shah and Sarah Piercy, and thank you so much for setting this up. We will be able to email out the webinar if you've signed up to our insight list, which you can do on our homepage. And I hope you've had an interesting time, and I hope you found the session helpful. Thank you.